What is the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, PRAC, and how does it conduct its oversight? What are the most effective ways to combat fraud related to the pandemic response? And what is meant by Agile Oversight, and how does it differ from traditional oversight approaches? I'll explore these questions and so much more with Bob Westbrooks, author of Left Holding the Bag, a watchdog's account of how Washington fumbled its COVID test, and former executive director of the PRAC. I want to understand, Bob, what prompted you to write this book, Left Holding the Bag? It's a really interesting read. And who's the core audience?
So I've heard a lot of authors say that they wanted to write a book. And then other authors say they felt compelled or they had to write the book. And that's what this was. It was like a story that I had that I felt like it had to come out. And it was because of the unique role that I had during the pandemic. I had front row seats to a historic moment in time in American history. And there was a lot of lessons learned and a lot of observations that I had. And I thought, this needs to get reduced to writing. We need to preserve our national pandemic story. On the individual level, the pandemic emergency's behind us. On the individual level, it's totally normal and healthy for us to try to forget all about that. But on a national level, we can't afford to forget the pandemic stories. The core audience for the book are really folks interested in government and politics. I think, but it is not a political book. As I say at the very beginning, I'm less concerned with who did what. I'm more concerned with where we fell short and how we're going to fix it moving forward. I think it's also the book will appeal to folks that are the true crime junkies because I do talk quite a bit about the historic fraud crisis and stunning crime wave that hit our country, and for history buffs as well. I lay out the historic record and the context from the very beginning in January through the pandemic emergency.
I want to talk about the oversight component, and that is the PRAC. As I mentioned earlier, it stands for the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. Bob, you were the first executive director. Can you tell us about the mission of the PRAC? How did it conduct oversight during your tenure? And I know this is a multi-layered question. How much of this concept in the bill did the legislature or the policy developers rely on the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board concept, which to some pejoratively was called the RAT Board, in the creation of a PRAC?
Absolutely. So one of the accountability mechanisms in the CARES Act was the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, the PRAC, and it was set up to bring together a committee of inspector generals who had oversight over large pandemic funds. So it was a committee of the Council of IGs. Okay. In a matter of months, we became significantly larger than SIGI itself. Mm-hmm. And then we had a professional staff, and under the law, there was called for the appointment of a full-time executive director who had experience overseeing large spending programs. And so that's one of the reasons that I was asked to take on the role. And the job was to coordinate oversight, pandemic oversight across government, and support the role of the IGs. There was also a number of additional authorities that was given in it, but that was how we originally saw our main role was, how do we leverage and bring the community together and increase collaboration and coordination among all the entities, not only the federal IGs, but also state and local partners as well. Some interesting historical footnotes that I put in the book. You mentioned the RAT Board. The Recovery Board is what the IGs like to refer to that as because of the term. So they didn't. The community didn't love that term, but originally one of the early versions of the CARES Act, somebody said, "Hey, let's call it the Coronavirus Accountability and Transparency Committee, or the CAT Committee." As opposed to the RAT Board. That was clever, but I think perhaps a little too cute for some folks. So they said, no, let's call it something else. And so somebody came up with the idea. The next version was the Coronavirus Stimulus Oversight Board, which, of course, that would have been shorthanded to the Coronavirus SOB, which that wouldn't have worked either. So somebody said, let's go with the PRAC. The PRAC won out, luckily. And there was some significant differences from the Recovery Board, but it's clear, and you can trace this. I said there was only a 7-day legislative gestation period, so congressional staff did a cut and paste from the Recovery Act, and they dropped it in the CARES Act, and then they originally vetted it with the IG community. And the original response from the IG community was, we don't think we need an additional organization at this point in time because SIGI is so mature. The IGs are doing well. They have many have their own data analytics capabilities. So why don't you just fund the individual offices? We may not need a new organization, but luckily wiser minds prevailed, and we realized we needed to do that, but we needed to bring it up to date. Some of the ways they brought it up to date was to create a full-time executive director, which is the role that I served in. In addition to that, they gave us investigative authority. And what's interesting about that is we did not use that authority to hire an army of agents. We could have. We had the budget for it. But we didn't want to compete with the IGs that were already in this space. We're like, well, how do we use that authority to really leverage what the IGs are doing? So we use that really from a data analytics standpoint, because that gave us the authority to get access to certain non-public data sets that we would not have otherwise been able to get. So that was a super powerful tool that we have. And then the other one, and I call it the great superpower that Congress gave us. I think we might talk about this a little later, but it's the direct hire authority. Mm-hmm. So Congress said, okay, if we need to get this organization up quickly, you have direct hire authority. You can hire rehired annuitants. So you can hire retired federal employees. You can bring them back without it impacting their pension. You can hire folks without federal status. You can set administrative salaries up to a limit. And the benefit is a draw to people, because it's only a 5-year term, is if they stay for 2 years, they will acquire federal civil service status. So those are very powerful tools in terms of like a lesson learned from a legislative standpoint, that we could not have done what we did if Congress did not give us those tools. And I saw the benefit. When you're a small agency, there's always a risk that those tools can be used and not be effective, right? And the classic people would be like, well, you can use those to promote cronyism. But when you're under the microscope like we were going to hire the best of the best, and we did. So those are really powerful tools, and I'm proud that we're able to use them to the full extent. And then final thing, so we were the recovery board was primarily an audit and transparency office that really their claim to fame was on the transparency side and data analytics. We had audit authority, investigative authority, and the transparency mission, and we used all three.
What prepared you to create a new office in your background, or how did you do it?
Nothing prepares you for this challenge. And, like most people, when you accept a new job, I'm like, of course I can do that. And then you quickly pivot your chair around and you Google or you go to Amazon to see if there's any books that might help you in your journey. There was nothing. And quite honestly, that was another reason why I wanted to write this book, is this is not the last crisis we'll be facing. And I hope that this book will give the next person that has to lead an oversight office a little bit of insight on how we went about doing it. It was really, to me, it was like the only way, and it was really quick. It's like, we're going to have to beg, borrow, and deal our way to the solution, period. So the very first act I did, which, literally within an hour, was I need a lawyer on staff. We needed a smart lawyer to bring on board to help with all that begging and borrowing and dealing, and we were able to get a great lawyer on detail pretty quickly. Next thing we needed was an IT person, because you need the technology to do this. And then it became almost like ESPN. It's like now, next, later. It's like you have to segment what you're doing, and it's like, what do I need to do today? What do I need to do this week? And what do I need to do this month? And then from there, it quickly became, we need a stand-up plan. And we need to devise sprints, 30-day sprints, so we can measure our progress, and that's what we did. But the challenge to it, and what was the struggle, was, you fight this urge of any warm body will do, and you can't give in to that. And you also have to. We had to fight the pressure, the intense pressure that we had to move quickly. And I'm like, so I developed this mantra that I would remind myself regularly. It's like, I'm moving forward with the required urgency in a swift and deliberate manner. And I likened it to my days when I was a law enforcement officer, and we do search warrants. And you go in and you do a search warrant of somebody's house. You're moving swiftly, and you're clearing the rooms to make sure you're not going to get hurt, but you're not racing into a house because there's significant unknowns. But you have to move in a swift and deliberate manner. And that was our mindset from the beginning. It's like, as long as we do that, we'll be okay. So we started looking at the skill sets that we needed to hire for using our direct hire authority and saying, this is not a traditional agency. We need different skill sets. And so we'd identify those skill sets. One of the things, like, I guess anybody that starts a new agency, you look at the statute and what did Congress write? What did they intend for us to do? What didn't they write? And where did they give us flexibility to use our discretion? And so I identified the musts and the shalls in the statute and said, okay, here's what we need to do, and we need to get some points on the board. And we did. And that's how we did. And so, we had a 6-month was the mark. We said we need to be fully staffed with all the key leadership positions filled within 6 months. And that's not only getting a job announcement out or recruiting people and doing all the interviews, that's actually bringing them on board. And we hit our mark.
I was wondering, the next thing you wrote was Agile Oversight. And I was hoping you could tell us what that is and how does that concept, because you hear about Agile everywhere now, right? But how does that concept in its practice kind of differ or complement traditional oversight activities?
Great question. And this is the issue that's probably number one near and dear to my heart. Traditional oversight or audits can take about a year. We have a saying in the community that audits shouldn't have a birthday, but they sometimes do. They sometimes take longer than that. And policymakers and the American people needed insights now. That was one of these things that was like, that was a mantra for us, insights now. How do we provide insights now? And Agile is everywhere, right? And it had migrated several years ago into the internal audit world in the private sector. So they're actually experimenting with this, but it never really reached the federal oversight community. I'd written about this a couple of years ago, and I think part of the reason is our work has to be bulletproof, right? It's public by nature. It's going to live forever, and you're going to be criticized anyway. And so if you put out a product that is incomplete or not quite ripe, you're going to get criticized. So there's this reluctance, I think, from a lot of folks. And then there's the piece like, how does this actually fit within government auditing standards? So one of the first things we did was like, we need to promote this because we need insights now. So we have to figure out how and articulate how it fits within professional auditing standards. And we need to hold up those examples. So I'll give you a couple examples of what it means. So Agile, when we talk about Agile, it's really about smaller scoped, iterative, shorter term projects and working closely with your auditees or stakeholders to deliver what they want or need. Okay, some great examples, and I'm super proud of the community for this. April 6th, 2020. So the CARES Act was just signed. The pandemic was raging. The Health and Human Services Acting Inspector General Christy Grimm and her team put out a survey report, a national survey of PPE supplies in our nation's hospitals, personal protective equipment. In a matter of 4 days, they had surveyed 323 hospitals around the country to identify that, and they were the first people to really sound the alarm like, hey, our hospitals and our nursing and healthcare staff, they don't have the PPE supplies that they need. And they're not ready. They're not ready when this pandemic really hits hard. And so that was an example, that pulse survey, pre-pandemic, you're not going to get in a matter of a few days, you're not going to see a product like that on the street, but it was so critically important for HHS OIG to get that product out. And I'm eternally grateful because I've got 2 of my kids are hospital nurses. And so it wasn't just like a national, theoretical thing for me. I mean, it was very personal for me that I wanted the American people in the White House to know that there is not enough PPE equipment in our nation's hospitals where my kids work to try to save other people's lives. That was a great example in my mind of Agile Oversight. Another one that people don't think about, and I really credit Justice Inspector General Michael Horowitz for this, pandemic was raging in our nation's prisons. And we often don't think about that. It's not a first priority, right? But for family members that have loved ones in prisons and for people that, Americans that work in the Bureau of Prison Systems and their families, it is a major concern. And so we didn't know what the positive rates were, hospitalization, or the death rates were in our nation's prisons. So one of the things that the Justice OIG did was to get that data, and then they created dashboards on their website to report that data so that loved ones could go on and see in the facility that their loved ones were incarcerated at or where their loved ones worked. They could see exactly the situation, not only at that facility, but in relation to nationwide numbers. So I think it was critically important, Agile Oversight. And those are things that they're non-traditional audit work. I've been very clear on this from the beginning. Agile will never take the place of traditional oversight work. It's there to really augment and supplement what is there, but whether it's a need to provide more transparency or a need to provide more oversight and sound the alarm quickly, that's what the IGs can do using Agile Oversight tools.
Your book does a wonderful job of telling that story and the evolution and maturation and gestation of the PRAC. But I was hoping, you also do a great part in the latter part of your book about what we can learn from this experience and what we can do better. And I'd like to spend some time on that. And I want to highlight some of your insights. What does transparency and accountability, why do transparency and accountability, Bob, go hand in hand? And could you elaborate on the 6 C's North Star design principles with government data?
Yeah, absolutely. Transparency is absolutely key. Quite simply, from an audit or an investigative standpoint, you can't audit or police what you can't see, right? So transparency is key for watchdogs. But transparency also plays another important role, deterrence. Don't discount the significance of public scrutiny or public shame. It is a powerful deterrent. On the very same day that I was appointed PRAC Executive Director, April 27, 2020, the media reported that the Los Angeles Lakers had quietly given back their PPP loan because they were identified as having taken it and perhaps not in need of a PPP loan. There were other prominent recipients that gave back their loans because they were subject to public scrutiny or shame. Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, Shake Shack, Nathan's Hot Dogs, they all got millions of dollars in PPP loans and realized that maybe we are not entitled, as maybe that's not who Congress, the American people, had in mind with small business relief. And there's another piece, and there's a theme I mentioned quite a bit in the book. Oversight is a team sport. And there's a guy that I want to hold up the project on government oversight, Pogo, who does just amazing work, and USA Facts. But there's also scholars and academics that probably have done the leading work on looking at the role of fintech lenders on the PPP program. Some fascinating research there. And then there's a guy that I hold up in the book. His name is Jim Richards. He's out of California, former federal prosecutor, former bank risk management guy, who knows more about PPP fraud than probably anybody I know outside of government. And because of public data, he would scrutinize individual fraud cases and provide insights and perspectives from his role as a prosecutor and a bank person that I don't know that anybody else could have done that. And he would post these on LinkedIn, and I think he's got like 188 chapters now where he digests these fraud cases. And I thank God that we live in a country where we have data that's publicly available, that somebody like Richards can go and pull this data down and enlighten all of us and keep the issue front of mind. So that's the benefit of transparency. On the 6 North Star design principles on government data, public federal data should be comprehensible, right? It should be easy to understand. It should be citizen-focused, right? Concentrated on their interests. Should be comprehensive or as complete as practicable. Should be connected with contextual links to other data. Should be contemporaneous or timely, and it's got to be correct. Now, if you go to pandemicoversight.gov, I think you'll see a website that really embodies or incorporates those 6 principles there. It's never going to be perfect, but I think that's a North Star that you need to be driving towards.
So how can we make anti-fraud activities a national priority?
So as I write in the book, from my seat, I believe, Washington fumbled. The COVID test in many ways failed the American people. There's plenty of blame to go around. The first thing we have to do is preserve the national pandemic story, and hopefully this book will be part of that, and we need to reflect on how the pandemic evolved. I worry, though, that folks focus too much on the shortcomings of the opposing party rather than addressing the root cause. I think we have to recognize the national security implications of fraud. I mentioned APT 41 and our adversaries not only stealing our PII information, personal identifying information, in hacking into our systems, but also the Secret Service confirmed that they were believed to be responsible for $20 million in fraud losses, and probably much higher, and probably have hit all 50 states. So we have to recognize the national security implications of fraud, right? So the first thing is a statement of intention here. I think there are great lessons that we learned from the American Rescue Plan that need to be fixed in law or regulation or White House directive. And one of those is on the implementation side. I know that's one of the issues in Washington now is the messiness of implementing what seem to be great ideas. Well, what we did with the American Rescue Plan, and it wasn't perfect, but I think it was pretty good, is we had senior level people at the table from the beginning before the White House would sign off on implementation, where from our perspective, we wanted to know two things. What are you doing about program integrity, and what are you doing about transparency? And we would ask the tough questions. Those meetings had positive results. One of the things was that immediately comes to mind was through those meetings, we were able to drive the Small Business Administration to block foreign IP numbers. That was a direct benefit of this is a no-brainer. We need to figure out how, at the very least, we can build this fraud control in. But there were a number of examples where we were able to tighten up controls incrementally over time by using these what we call gold standard meetings. So I think that's critical for us moving forward, is having a clear direction from the White House that's implemented from senior level people, getting the right people at the table to talk about fraud and transparency.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with Bob Westbrooks, author of Left Holding the Bag, a watchdog's account of how Washington fumbled its COVID test, and former executive director of the PRAC. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at iTunes, Spotify, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.